camera somewhere. Cool.
Well, she said that the people who found out, she was like, no idea what that is. He was like, you don't have to do that. Like, she was like, no, and he was like, could you guess? She was like, no, I was like, right, yeah. And then he was like, okay, could you draw like this other thing? Saying, and but then she said she like she like we wouldn't like talk to me, so she could like put it on it, but she didn't know. So then she was like, what? Let me go to this place. I wanted to. Yeah. Done now, then? Okay. Oh, gosh. Well, I was about to say like, what? I'm not gonna be like, no, it's gonna be the two now. It's gonna be the answer.
Tim, I'm gonna be on the Zoom chat, so, if anyone has questions there, I'll be there. And if anyone from the room asks questions, it would be nice if you repeated that, just because the event froze at your.
Yeah.
But you're not sharing the screen for the Zoom folks yet. You might want to do that and then you can get started. Yep, okay. Perfect, great. Good.
Okay.
And then feel free to say it.
Everybody's settled.
Oh, got to go back here.
All right. I'll get started here. I'm gonna stay probably close to the computer just because the only microphone we're using is on my laptop today. So if you have trouble on Zoom hearing me, feel free to raise your hand and we'll make sure that you can hear everything. So my name is Tim Divoll. I'm a data scientist in the CCV group here. And just a little bit of background from me. I am trained as an ecologist, so I have a background in research. And I did not have undergrad research experience. So once I got into my research in grad school, my advisor kind of had an idea, but didn't have a lot of experience with it. And I studied bats and their diets. So she kind of had this idea. It was an exciting time because next gen sequencing had just started to become used in ecology. But we didn't have a lot of experience actually doing that work. So it was on me to kind of dig into the literature and figure out what other people were doing, and then trying to figure out how we could use the same methods that other people were using for our own studies. So I wanted to ask, how many of you have kind of started a new research project and you dig into the code and it's either, I actually found pseudocode one time, which was just kind of bullet points of the things that you would need to do in somewhat of a code format. Or there's no code for the paper, right? And you have to email the authors and ask them if there's code, and they say, well, maybe, let me see if I can find it. I'm not sure if I have it or not. That has also happened to me. So, those methods are good because we have something to work with, but it doesn't mean we're going to be able to reproduce the results of that study, even if we have their data that they used. So that's kind of where I got into this, got interested in reproducible research. And for a recent project, we used Quarto Books, and it was really easy to set up. I thought it was going to be a task, but it wasn't too bad. Cool. So some of the barriers, right, to reproducible research. I was looking at this paper by Alston and Rick. It's a really good guide. If anybody wants to look at that in the future, they kind of list out some of the things that make it difficult to reproduce research. And the first thing they listed was complexity. So you might need a lot of domain knowledge, especially if it's a very specific topic. Like even within biology, there are many subfields that if you don't know the lingo, it might be difficult to just jump in, say a research software engineer or a data scientist to jump in and run the code that they used if you're not familiar with the domain and you don't know kind of if the results are what you should be expecting or not, because it depends on the domain. There could also be a technological changes, such as this is kind of the shifting baseline problem. Hardware and software continue to advance, but if we're using some old code or something because that's what the lab was familiar with, it might be harder to reproduce that in the future if those software versions are outdated or not being maintained. That's a consideration. There's also human error, like people forget what they did. If anyone has ever done a big GIS project, you generate so many intermediate files and there's a lot of like just trying things until you figure out the right tools. And then if you don't take good notes, it's hard to kind of remember the exact steps you took when you did it. And the same thing happens sometimes with research code. There's the intellectual property. So sharing it could lead to others using it in a different way. So documenting and kind of establishing that this code or this method that you used, if your intellectual property, is important, so that people don't kind of misinterpret or use it the wrong way. And then this last one was more just, as I was thinking about this, it was more fun for me. I added this, the chaos. The world that we live in is really chaotic, right? So how do we, when the real world is messy and we're taking measurements from that world, how can we expect that we're going to get the same results every time? And that's kind of the repeatability problem. So this is why we have things like p-values, right? Is if we do something a bunch of times, what's our estimate that we'll get the same results or something more extreme? So predicting things is hard, repeating things is hard. I had one example. I always have to interject bats somehow because that was what I studied. But if we think about the real world and we measured something like a wavelength, we might expect we'll get the same result every time because it's pretty consistent. But when I studied bats, I found this study. If we think about, so these are two different bat species in the Southwest, and if we were to just randomly go out and measure their diets in anywhere in the brown or anywhere in the blue, we could measure their diets a bunch of times, and we're going to find that they're both just eating moths. But the one time that our random sample lands in that area that they overlap, we're going to get a different result. So the one species actually, because of this biological phenomenon of they have to compete with another species, they'll shift to eating beetles. So if we don't sample enough, we're not going to find that species in blue actually eats moths, but sometimes beetles. So that's just an example of the chaos. I like to call this animals behaving badly. It's like just as soon as you think that you have them figured out and you understand what they're doing, they do something different. So this is really the repeatability problem. Repeatability is hard. So if it's hard to even take measurements and get the same results, then it's going to be hard to reproduce an entire study. Every time we measure, it's like a little experiment. So in that context, and translating that into kind of code and preparing the code that goes with your research so that somebody else can reproduce it, we're really going to need all that source data. We're going to need the exact code, the exact software versions, and the environment. Like even changing the operating system, we could get different results if somebody else runs the same exact code with the same data. Or it just doesn't work, which is a barrier for people to being able to reproduce that. So I had a little bit of fun with this. I wanted to ask AI to generate just a little cartoon, right? Like somebody starting out, you have code that you found from a paper and you want to generate it. Just run the code, you try it, doesn't work. You think it's going to be a quick thing, and you have their data, you have their code, but it just doesn't run. So AI, generative AI is kind of classic for, like, some of the words were kind of messed up. So I just asked it, like, this is pretty good, but can you just fix the words? And I got an entirely different character and theme and cartoon. So it made me realize that even though we have AI to help now, and there's this thought that maybe we could use it to make things more repeatable and precise every time we do it, AI is really bad at reproducibility too. It's the same idea, right? But the picture is very different. So reproducibility is also very hard. So there are things that we can do as researchers or software engineers or data scientists to make it easier for others to be able to repeat our studies or do a very similar study with their own data using the same methods, the same code. Another really good guide is this British Ecological Society reproducible code guide. And it is pretty specific to ecology, but I think everything that they lay out is really useful for any field of research. So we need the data, we need the code. The code really needs to be documented. If somebody is new, like a new master's student that hasn't coded a lot, they're going to really rely on that documentation to be able to figure out what the code is doing and what they need to do to get it running. And the software dependencies, we really need those so that we can be making sure we're using. So for example, if you use different Python versions, they might be calculating certain things different ways and we might get different results. So that's really important. But I found this table in blue here in that British Ecological Society publication, and I'm going to share with you an approach that we took on a recent paper in the Cartsinel lab that I work with. And I just kind of put all this together as we were working on it. And then I found this and I was reading through the steps, like record the versions of the packages, make sure there's a README, get somebody else to review it, add a license to your code, make it public. So I was reading all these things like, okay, these are all the things that we're doing for our paper. So this is good. We're on track. But there's a lot more in that guide. If we have time at the end, I can pull it up and we can look at it. But the link will be in the slides as well that you can refer to it. So in almost all fields now, when you do research and you publish, almost all journals are requiring a data accessibility or availability statement. Some journals even have integrations, like they will, if you haven't archived your data or code somewhere like Dryad, they have integrations where they do it for you. So it's very common. And in your statement, usually you need a DOI to tell where you've archived things, and you won't be able to get through the review process until you've demonstrated that you've archived your at least your data and possibly the code. Typically, there's at least a hint in that data accessibility statement of where the code is. It might be just a link to a GitHub repository. It might say the code are with the data in the Dryad repository. Sometimes it's a little unclear where until you start clicking on links and then you find it. And I just wanted to note that things like Dryad, Zenodo, Figshare, they may or may not contain the code. Some people may split the code into a GitHub repository and then just say, we have it in a repository. Some people package it. GitHub, though, typically doesn't contain the data. So the data might be in one of these other repositories or just with the supplement directly on the paper. It kind of all depends on the size of the data. If it's just a few small CSV files, they might be in the supplement of the paper. But it's important that in that data accessibility statement, we kind of let people know where all these pieces are and make it easier for them to find all these pieces that they're going to need to run the code and play with the data. So typically, even though you read the data accessibility statement, you read the paper, you go looking for these things, there's typically one thing missing. Maybe the code was only run on one computer in the past. We'll look at an example that I worked with recently. Maybe it's specific to some HPC, like a high performance cluster at a specific university. So a lot of things might be hard coded in the code. And that's okay. We can work with that to update it and get it running on our system, but we just need to be realistic that it's going to take a little bit of work. We can't just kind of download it and run it and look at the results, which can be a challenge sometimes in research when your PI is kind of expecting you to have some preliminary results or be able to demonstrate that you can use the code. And it often takes a lot longer than we might expect. It might be that pseudocode. I actually had to dig into the history of pseudocode because I was kind of interested. And what I found was that it was a technique used in computer science in earlier, kind of a few decades ago, because it was not language specific. So it was a technique from computer science. And then I think people started using it as a technique to just, the last thing you want to do after you've gotten all of your research done, written the paper, and you're in the review process is kind of spend a few weeks kind of, laying out the code. So people started just kind of providing at least something like some pseudocode that people could work with. But it kind of presents challenges. So typically, there's usually something missing, and we just have to find that one thing that's missing, figure out what we need to do, and then we're off to the races. We can kind of get things running. But it's often like one missing puzzle piece turns into a few, and they kind of accumulate, and it's a bigger challenge to figure out what we need to do to get it running. The software is often a challenge. So I'm going to jump to this Dryad repository. Get the link to work. I recently was working with the Cartsinel lab here at Brown, and in the lab they were able to follow the methods from this paper really easily and get some exciting results, and then kind of hand that off to me. So we had DNA sequence results, And we wanted to use the same code that the paper used to analyze our data and see if we can, so the technique here is really to try to package together a bunch of different samples into one sequencing run and get a bunch of data for the minimum amount of cost. So it's kind of extending the capabilities of current sequencing technologies. And we were able to do this, but I was looking at this and at first glance, I got really excited because now in my capacity as a data scientist, I see code, I see data. Oh, we can definitely work with this. Let's get it running. And you can see there are R scripts, there are FASTA files, are data files. There's a bash script that calls these other R scripts. There's a Python script, some files, parameter files. There's a README. So and this is a dryad repository, so it has the data and the code all in one place. They even have an abstract. And if we keep scrolling down, this is great because now we have descriptions of each of the files that are there and what they contain and which scripts might call these data files. They have things kind of in triplicate because they ran it at different, with different subsets of numbers of samples and kind of the data structure. So in my mind, I was thinking there must be a GitHub repository somewhere that has this same data structure with the code in it that we can, but that's not the case. I had to kind of figure out that I need to make these folders. So it took a little while to kind of get these folders right, and the descriptions didn't quite match what the scripts were actually asking for. But all this stuff is here. And some of these things that they're describing were generated. Some are the actual scripts in here. So that also took a little bit. So I kind of felt like they could have organized it a little bit better of like, these are all the things that will get generated when you run the code. These are all the things that we provide now. And we have descriptions of the code itself, which is awesome. So the one thing I didn't realize until I started trying to run this, there is one major thing that's missing. Does anybody kind of have ideas to be able to regenerate the results, even with their data?
I don't see a list of like the packages used, the dependencies that would be nice to have probably for both the R and Python
Yep.
stuff.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So I don't know what Python version they used, what R version, and depending on what R version they used, all the R packages that you need to load, which should be listed at the top of the scripts, right? So we can kind of figure that out. But depending on the versions of R that we use compared to what they used, those R packages may be calculating things differently. It turned out that they were using a bash tool called Dialogue. You might be familiar with it. And I didn't realize that. It took me a few days really to figure out that, oh, I need to install this Dialogue tool, and it brings up an interactive window. And it looks like Windows 95. It almost looks like a boot window from Linux. And you have to go through the tool. So I couldn't figure out why the script wouldn't run, and I'm trying to like piece it all together. I ended up having to abandon using this, and we were able to use some of the similar ideas, but it was just taking way too long to even get their code to run. Even with all the work that they did to provide all these descriptions and have everything in one place, it also was extremely hard-coded to their high-performance cluster. And even though they were using variables in the code in some places, they were still kind of hard coding file names for 96 different samples. So it was just hard to work with. So we tried to, in a different paper that we worked on before, we tried to make it as transparent as possible. So in this case, it's nice because we have CCV working with the lab. So we have researchers and data science kind of working together. And these are just some of the critical figures that came out of the publication. And it actually, the code ended up being 8 different notebooks. Some of them I generated, some of them Hannah generated, some of them Tyler, the PI, generated. So 3 different people, 3 different styles of coding, but it was really kind of 8 different scripts that we had. So we had to kind of figure out, what do we do? Do we just dump it in a repository, or how do we handle this? We're pulling data from different APIs, so there's a bunch of different software dependencies that we had. And let's jump to the next one. What we did was we provided a GitHub repo with the source code. We did have to kind of split things up because the data files are pretty large. So we have a GitHub repo that we will look at. We have a README that links back to the paper that was published. So this repository is just for the code for this publication. We describe all the dependencies. We also archived the GitHub repository with Zenodo so that we could get a DOI, so that the journal wanted a DOI for this resource, so that this resource could be cited as its own thing. And we'll talk about, when you do this archiving, GitHub has an integration with Zenodo, but you need to have a release of your code on GitHub to be able to integrate it that way. Oops. And then we used Quarto Books to kind of publish this code book with GitHub Pages. And Quarto has integrations with GitHub Pages that makes it really easy. So we basically build out this code book, we run it and get all the outputs, and then we publish it on GitHub Pages. So somebody can just click on a link and see all the code. And then if they want to dig into it further, they go to the GitHub repository, they can get the code. The data we actually kept with the supplement of the paper. But we found that in the review process, at first we didn't provide just the hosted link. We provided the link to the GitHub repository, and the reviewers said, just give us the link. Like, that's really great because we can just see all the code, we can see the outputs right there and not have to dig through a bunch of different links. So this worked really well for the review process. And sometimes you want to just see how these outputs are generated, but you might have to debug that whole process and get the code running, right? So if you have a hosted link, that makes that process really, really easy. One thing that I think is important with this, though, is that we had 8 different code notebooks, but I wanted to have it organized so that if somebody's looking at the code, if they've already read the paper, they can go back to the paper and figure out, oh, these 4 headings are actually the sections of the methods. So the code books in these sections are explaining those parts. So as a young grad student, I always found that kind of hard to figure out, like, where in the code is it doing this thing they're describing in the methods, or this figure that's in the results, if there's a lot of code. So kind of making things circular is nice, so that if somebody's looking at the code, they can figure out where it is in the paper. If they're looking at the paper, they know where to find all the resources in the code. This is a little bit above and beyond the typical, what people typically do. So this is not the only way, it's just a method that worked really well for our scenario because we had so much code was generated by different people. And we wanted to make sure that it could be run. So the cool thing about Quarto notebooks, it's really easy to set up the project in RStudio. There's just, from the drop-down menus, we can just choose, like, make a new Quarto notebook, and we'll get a project file, and it will track kind of all of our versions of our software packages. And then once you have the project set up, and you have to run everything locally, right? Because we're already probably running the code anyways to make sure it runs and we get all the outputs we want. And we can cache all of the figures and the outputs right there in our environment. So you know it runs on your local environment, which is great. And then it should run for somebody else if they had that same exact environment. The nice thing about publishing with GitHub Pages is that it'll run it in a different environment hosted by GitHub. So if you set up a GitHub action to run the code, say on GitHub server, you know that the code will work on at least your local and on that environment, which is nice. It kind of helps you, and you'll get errors as you run it locally, and you'll figure out like, oh, even though it's working in my environment, there's still these things that I need to clean up for it to be more reproducible. But this link is on so the Quarto documentation is really nice. They actually have all this information about GitHub Pages and how to set up your project. There are several ways to do it. So it just kind of depends on your use case and your scenario. But basically you're using little YAML files, and you just have these parameters that you type in, and we'll look at what I did in a minute. And it kind of walks you through what you need to do. But with the GitHub actions, if you have code and you have this special branch called like GH Pages is what they suggest. So you know that anytime you merge code into that, it's going to regenerate your notebook from the action, and it will be there. So as you're testing things, you can do it this way, but it's really nice. They also have this way to do it locally. So if you've gotten it running in your local environment, you just don't have time to work with the GitHub action and do that, you can still publish the code to the web page from your local environment with all the outputs and everything, because it's cached everything. And we'll look at what that looks like, the difference between doing it locally and with the action. So this was really nice. It was super helpful when I was trying to figure out how to do all this. Yeah, let's go to, we'll go to my RStudio environment. You can see what that looks like. Okay, so in my RStudio, so I have a bunch of things in my environment from when I ran this. And in my terminal, the last thing that I did was I from my local environment, I published it to the page. So it's a little bit interactive. And we're caching things. So you can see that there's 8 different notebooks, and there's an index, an intro, and then 8 code notebooks. So it ran all those, it found all the data that it needed, it generated the outputs, and it dumps them in these folders here. But each one of these chapters of the book has its own QMD file, which is this basically the same as an RMD file. So it's kind of a unique notebook of code that will run. And it will ask you, do you want to publish it to this page? And you just say yes. You can also publish to Hugging Face with this integration if you wanted to, instead of GitHub Pages. So that's an option. But that's kind of what it looks like. So you just break it out by code notebooks. You can add these other QMD files, like a summary, references, if you had a bunch of references in there. Yes. Yeah, so caching, there's this freeze option in the YAML, and in the freeze, so it saves all of your figures in here, which is really nice, and the executed results. So any outputs, it'll save it as JSON, which is really nice. So then when you go to publish it and it renders everything, it takes those cached results and those figures. Yes, let's look at that next. So there's this one overall YAML. Let me make this bigger. There's this one YAML that kind of controls everything, called your Quarto .yml. And in here, you can set up your parameters. set it up into parts and chapters that you want to break it out into. That will define kind of what it looks like. And yeah, so when you put this freeze as a freeze auto in your execute, that will cache everything. So it made it really easy. So let's look at the actual code book now to see how it looks once it's published. Yes. So this is the published page, and just from clicking on this one URL, I kind of wanted to make it really obvious. This is related to this research paper. Here's where you can find it. Here's who you can email. But then it's nice we have this introduction that we can link back to, oh, all the codes here in the repository. If you're going to run this in the repository, I provided an empty data folder so people know they need to download these data sets from the supplement and put them in there. They're a little bit too large to host in the GitHub repository. And then once you go into each kind of chapter and you have a nice table of contents, you can kind of see the code for each workflow that we did. I'll just jump to the last one because it kind of has some of the figures, and just as an example. So any of the things that generated figures, we'll get them right in line. You can see everything. And then anybody that wants to go to the next step of running the code, they know where to find the code in the GitHub repository. And there's not really, you probably will hit a limit at some point, but there's, this could be broken out into probably as many chapters and parts as you wanted to. So it's pretty nice. And it's the same thing that you'll see with people that are building tutorials or some of like R for Data Science, that book, it's set up the same exact way. So you can really put a ton of content in here. And let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Cool. So, oh, yeah.
If the data is too large to host on GitHub, like how are you able to still use GitHub Actions to compile the data into your
Yep.
data set?
That's a great question. So that is, yes, the question was if the data set is too big to host the data in the GitHub repository, how do you use the GitHub Actions? And let me jump right to the repository. We can talk about that now. I was going to do it later. So you will notice this is the actual GitHub repository, and you'll notice there's an X here. So my action failed. When you build this workflow, so I had this problem. It should work based on the Quarto documents. If you've run it locally and you do Quarto publish locally, it should be caching the stuff that it needs. But I was having this issue that then when I would update anything in the repository and merge the code, the notebook would be there, but the figures were gone, even though they're being cached. So there's something off. So I went down the road of, for demonstration purposes, trying to update my workflow so that you can kind of see what you would have to do. And it would involve I had to install GDAL because we were using the raster package in R, which requires GDAL on the system. You have to install R, all the packages you need, and set up the Quarto notebook and everything. So that was the issue that I hit here, was that to regenerate it from scratch, you would need the data. So I just ran out of time in doing it that way, but you could have the data download from somewhere, like from a supplement, and update your action to make sure it has those data files available. So I just used the local version once I had all the updates done. And so that's something important to talk about too, is that in the review process, you might have this completed, but then the reviewers ask you to fix something, or there's changes that you need, or you just found a typo or an error or something. So there might be some maintenance in satisfying the reviewer requests and kind of making sure the code is up to date. And the nice thing is that if you publish a new release of your GitHub code, it will update your Zenodo archive so that the code is the latest version there. Cool. Yeah, so we had the repo, which had the code, and the Quarto project. We released a version so we could get a Zenodo DOI. So this specific journal wanted a DOI for the data and everything. And we added a restrictive license. So Brown Technology Innovations is a group that we have on campus. And when they saw the advertisement for this talk, they reached out to me and said, "Oh, we have a Brown license that you could use, so that," because what they're seeing, and this actually happened to somebody at Brown, is that AI tools can now scrape the internet and look through GitHub and find code, and then take it and use it for something commercial where they're making money. But Brown is not getting credit for that, because this code, if it's generated at Brown, there's intellectual property from the PI, the university, the students, the grad students, postdocs. So that actually did happen. So they said, you probably should use the Brown license, which will protect Brown and people associated with Brown, so that their intellectual property is not getting stolen. One important thing to mention is that this license is more restrictive. So in my README, sorry, I forgot to show the README before, but here's the DOI for the Zenodo, the citation, a little overview. So I have all these links to kind of make everything circular. So if somebody ends up here, they can find the paper, find the data, find all the stuff they need, and tell people what software they need. But right beside the README in the repository is the license tab. So if we go to this license tab, our computer science department has a Brown license. So there's this. So typically, I always would just pick the MIT license. If we're open sourcing code, here it is. We want people to use it, right? This in the new age of AI kind of scraping things, this could protect Brown. And I think really it would just make sure that if somebody were going to use this software to make money and commercialize it, Brown would get its credit for that. So they would need permission for somebody to use this. It doesn't mean people can't use it for commercial purposes. It would mean they would need to contact Brown Tech Innovations and ask them, "Hey, can we use this?" That is a good segue into the next slide. Let me go back. So Brown Tech Innovations also does things like helping with copyrights and patents and startups. So it gets a little unclear what happens if you're somebody that works in a lab, that there's also a startup, there's intellectual property on both sides. What happens when you leave Brown, but you have this protective license on your code? Can you still use that at your own startup? So I think it's all just conversations with Brown Tech Innovations, and they can work out agreements and everything. It's just something to consider, you know. I'm not saying don't use MIT license. It's just what we used for this code. And there are options there, but both Brian Demers and Melissa Simon at Brown Tech Innovations can help with any of those kind of questions of what do I do? What license do I need? Actually, I'm going to go back one. Another really good resource is this choosealicense.org. It's actually a GitHub website. I'm not sure if they produced it themselves or it is available though through GitHub. So it's kind of like a book when you're a kid, like choose your own adventure. If you have this scenario, click on this link and it'll kind of guide you into the different options of the different licenses. And some of them are not that different from each other, but there are very subtle distinctions, which I feel like would be easier to understand if you had a legal background. And but there's a bunch of options here, so that's a nice resource to kind of look at. If you're unsure, there are resources to help figure out what would be the best approach. So I think this is the last slide I have, and I want to make sure there was time for some questions, but one thing that we also could do, we didn't do this for this paper, but you could containerize the software. So then you know that it runs in that container. Everything would be provided. So it's kind of like debugging the GitHub action where you'd have to make sure everything is installed that you need and it runs and the data are in there and it can be downloaded into the container. So if you made a Docker file that specified all the installs that you need and where the data are, you could run Docker directly on Windows, or something that we've done at Brown is you can use Apptainer, which used to be Singularity. So if you're on Oscar and you see anything related to Singularity, Apptainer is kind of the new version of that. Because the thing is that with Oscar, there's no Windows, so you need the container to be able to run on Linux, and Singularity allows you to do that. So we also have this open on-demand app, and there's one app called RStudio on Singularity. So you could build a Docker file, and then on Oscar, you could pull that Docker file with Singularity, and now you have a Singularity container with all the stuff it needs, and you can run RStudio in that container and all the software is there. So we didn't do this. That would be like extra effort for just submitting stuff for a paper, right? But in this case, we were kind of also, there was a class last semester that I was helping to teach. So some of the analyses from the paper that we worked out, we had pared down versions of some of these notebooks with just the methods that we were using with students so that they could start their own kind of research projects and ask their own questions after we've provided, say like a base analysis. Here's some DNA sequences, here's the variety, here's the geographic coverage, and then they could build upon that. So we do have a pared down container that we successfully used for a class. So a lot of students with no coding ability were able to just access this container, open it up in this app, and start running our code and have all the stuff that we need. So even though it's a lot more effort, it's not that much more than what we did already. And I know I have good confidence that people with little coding experience can now access the code and the resources and run it. And we know that it will run. It took a little debugging, so if you go down this route, you might need to test it with a few people before making it public, but it's kind of a nice way to go so that all the code's there and people can actually use it and reproduce either your study exactly with your results or do a very similar study with their own data and get reasonably similar results. I think that's all that I had for slides. If anyone has any further questions. Paul?
What about if the data cannot be shared because it contains PHI, PII, something like that?
That's a great consideration. So I would think most journals, there would be kind of an exemption, it's just kind of kind of a thing with research in certain fields that we can't share this exact data. We could always provide a test data set with an anonymized, you know, just so people can still run the code. A lot of times, so now I'm noticing, especially with ecology, now the papers that have a lot of code, you kind of need to look at the code to make sure that the methods are valid or actually what people are describing. So even if you couldn't reproduce the entire study, a little test set with a toy example is still much better than just saying like, sorry, we can't share anything. Yeah. Good question.
Yeah, paper that one is working on now and thinking like, I'd like to do something like this, the way we did for Taylor's paper. I know that like at that point we had multiple code notebooks, like you say, multiple people, like, and I think a big effort was like getting it so that it was organized in a way that made sense for this sort of code notebook. So I'm just curious if you have like thoughts on how someone could have some insight into like, you know, starting to organize code notebooks, even like when you're starting to code for a new project.
Yeah.
Like when you're like submitting to a journal and they're not requiring you to share your code yet, but like in those sort of prep steps so that we avoid that sort of last minute.
Yeah, that's a good consideration. I think if you are already working in a platform that has Quarto, like if you're using our code in this example, you could start a Quarto project and then that one little YAML file is really the one thing that would control how it all gets organized and how it looks. So you could kind of, as you're working along, you could be kind of laying out these parts and chapters, which I think also might help with figuring out your sections as you're writing too and your methods. Ideally, that's where we would be, is as you're working on the analysis, you're already thinking about what the writing looks like, and as you're writing, you're making sure that the code matches, and it's a lot of effort, and it's a lot of effort after the fact, right? So it is really nice if you can kind of think about it as you're working on your research. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, don't think about this being like the final product. Make a repository, make a Quarto project, and get it all sorted out there. And then once you make a new repository for the code, you're going to open source with the final product. But yeah, that's great. Anybody else? Anyone on Zoom? All right, we can give you 10 minutes back. All right, thank you. Yeah, that freeze auto.